You need more?
That enough?
Yeah. Now, let's see, Bruce. If you would put your hands over your eyes and you put your hands over your mouth.
You got ears?
Yeah.
I guess I'd like to start. One thing that I need to have on the tape, and Bruce, you gave me a brief summary of this the other day, but I'd like to understand what you guys perceived at the time. Is there's one Chemical Mortar Battalion left in the Army. Obviously, there are a lot of people who are saying, you know, we need to fold this function in with other things. So why is that Chemical Mortar Battalion picked up and raced over to Korea at top speed? I think that's something that is not
On September 50th,
not
it
understood.
was picked up and shoved because it was the only one in existence.
And
And they needed mortar support, and there's several units, all of it, Koreans and Australians and some others that had no heavy mortar support. That's the reason they sent us over. God knows why someone was brainy enough or stupid enough to organize us in February '49. They didn't know the war was coming. I suspect, I don't know, I suspect a good part of it was political.
Political within CWS, you mean?
Yeah, somebody wanted the outfit. Well, his name was Blaine or whatever, and have a combat unit in this post. Is that right, Tom?
I have no way of confirming that, except that my recollection is that there was a certain amount of stature and glory, if you will, in having a combat unit in a technical service, which is what the Chemical Corps was, and it was this was unheard of. Well, it was unprecedented, except you know, when it happened prior to World War II. But
Yeah,
I think I would bet General Boleyn, having at one time, I guess he was a commander of this thing, wasn't he?
He was the post commander at the time.
Oh, well, but I mean, way back, was he ever the commanding officer of the second?
Yeah, at the time of Pearl Harbor.
Yeah,
he
I
was.
heard he was.
Yeah, he was the one that announced
But,
Pearl Harbor to the battalion.
But you know, that may have been a sort of a move that he thought was good.
Yeah, and he put his aide de camp in as exec, with the idea that he'd take over, which he did later on.
And that was
That's why I said it's political. His Boleyn, Bob Boleyn, they used to call him. He was just glorifying himself. Thank God, though, that it existed, because otherwise, those some units over there had no heavy motor support. And the fact that they needed it was evident in the fact that we spent those 1,007 continuous days in action. One outfit go back in reserve, we go to another one's in the line.
It was no surprise to me that we were called upon to go because we were already trained. We had been in existence well over a year when the war broke out. We had fired at Indiantown Gap. We had been on field problems down at AP Hill, and we had gone on exercise swarmer down at Fort Bragg. And so we were as trained as anybody need be to go. And I remember when we first got on the line, so to speak, in Korea, everything worked properly because it was just as if we were at AP Hill. You know, everybody knew their job and they did it. I saw no confusion. It was just right that we go as well as anybody else.
Well, of course, the infantry, a lot of other people, infantry just loved to have us. They loved in World War II, they learned to love the mortar. And of course, they promptly swallowed it into each regiment. So they certainly had a huge influence. God damn, you got a mortar battalion, get it over there.
when you got over there, you landed at Pusan
Right.
Yeah.
and made what looks to me like an epic march.
Well, when we got off the ship, we got to a little village called Tong Nai, which is just north of Pusan. We stayed there for a few days, and as I understand it, we were to have moved by ship up to Incheon or someplace, but Colonel Bell was impatient about that, and he said, I've got organic transport, why don't you let us use it? So there was a party of 3 officers and 3 NCOs who were detailed to go up on train, and the rest of the battalion would come up by their own vehicles. And at Taegu, 1 officer and 1 sergeant got off to find a bivouac area to accommodate the battalion when it arrived. And then at Taejan, another officer and a sergeant got off. And the intelligence officer and I got off at Seoul. And of course, we traveled somewhat faster than the battalion had. The battalion was going to take 3 days to get up there, you see. But the train wasn't all that fast, because the afternoon of the day that we got to Seoul, the battalion came to Seoul. Fortunately, we had an area picked out, and the battalion could go into bivouac there.
When you're moving a battalion by convoy like that, what are the management problems that you face as a commander?
Not losing half of them.
Well, what did we have, 170 vehicles in the battalion?
Something like that. We had
Some great number.
45 in each company.
And of course, they can go only in single file. The roads in Korea were not built for a modern war, even what was modern in 1950. I can remember when the battalion arrived at Seoul, I was posted, because you see, I was the only enlisted man who knew where the battalion was going. I was posted at the Han River Bridge that night, and I think the last maintenance vehicle, motor pool vehicle, was at the end of the convoy to service any breakdown, and I think they crossed the Han River at sometime like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So you can see that really that convoy was some hours long. We of course had radios on the convoy. I was not on the convoy, obviously, but I can only imagine that company commanders were somewhat anxious about their men arriving. And as I understand it, somewhere around Taegu, guerrillas, you see that the Incheon invasion had cut off an awful lot of North Korean soldiers, and their biggest problem was to get far up to north. Many of them were cut off, and some of them were between Taegu and Taejan, and they fired upon the train that I was on, and I subsequently learned that the battalion was fired upon by these. They became guerrillas because they were without supply, etc. These North Koreans. So that was an incident that, even though I was not with the battalion, I experienced it in my way. I lay down flat in the railroad car.
My recollection is it stopped the convoy for a short period, and there was some fire. I don't know whether you remember much of that, but I kind of recall it as the convoy had to stop, and then we resumed. I don't know. I never had any small arms fire in the immediate area I was in.
No, I don't recall it either, but you had to stop now and give them a break, for God's sake. It is a big problem managing that number of vehicles, and you're in an area where, I don't know if we had decent maps then. Well, we never had decent maps. We had Japanese maps, and we're not good, and there were no road signs. So you could, if your vehicle broke down, Carl mentioned the maintenance vehicle at the end. Must have been more than one, because we had plenty of breakdowns.
But if you contrast this with, say, the most recent thing in Iraq, this was simply, by and large, going from point A to point B unopposed. I don't know how many miles that was. What do you get?
What was it?
A couple hundred, maybe more.
Well, what's the parallel down at Pusan?
I think it was 600 and something. I tried to figure it up.
Because there's about 70 miles between each degree of latitude.
I just don't remember.
Well, when you got there, you were attached pretty quickly, and as I recall, the first combat mission was fired within a day or two of arrival.
No.
More than a day or two.
Was
we
it?
got to Pusan October 8th. First fire mission was, what the hell was it, October 23?
I'm sorry, I was thinking arrival
Up
at the north.
Yeah.
Within a couple of days, yeah, I was in this speech, that's why I remembered it. It was a couple of days after we get up there. Right, I think we got there October 20, fired the first mission October 23, something like that.
Yeah, by then we had gone from Seoul through Pyongyang, and Pyongyang had just been captured, I think, shortly before we arrived.
It was. I had heard that it had been secured, but in front of my Jeep going through Pyongyang was a British Bren gun carrier, which was clearing our way, and there were a bunch of utility wires down in the street, and I knew something had happened before we got there, but the city had not been wholly secured.
Bruce, I think you mentioned that our first mission, and I didn't remember where this was or which company fired it, but was it B? Yeah. So it. You said it was fired from Yongbayan. Is that your recollection?
I think so.
I know it was north of Pyongyang, but I don't know where.
I think so.
I'm almost positive it's in my diary.
In fact, I remember my recollection is we were out in the middle of nowhere, and this gave us all a big charge because many of us had, on the way over, and this shows the folly of being young.
It's like you said that this is out of speech, I researched it, probably took it out of his diary. But anyhow, we crossed the 38th on October 20, fired the first mission October 23 at Yongbyon, supported the 1st Rock Division.
Yeah.
10 days later, Pusan.
But I think many of the people who had sort of grown up in the immediate post-World War II era were saying, "Boy, I want to see a real war." Well, it was kind of a thrill to be able to really fire a fire mission. Little did we know what the next month would bring.
At that point, you were way short of people, and in the next few months, you got down at or below half of what the TO&E called for.
That's right.
Well, we're barely over half or so. When we get there, he gave us those 300 Koreans, 75 in each company. And is this being published? Because I was going to say they weren't worth a shit. In fact, they were worth less than that, worth less than nothing.
Better edit that out.
they were huge bothers.
I'll patch in somebody saying darn.
Well,
they weren't worth a darn.
Quickly made an effort to get rid of them.
Yeah, part of that I think was the fact that we just simply couldn't communicate with them. They were not very. They must have been just immediate recruits into the army.
That's right.
Oh,
they had not had any training within their own army.
They'd been in for days,
Yeah.
And they had, there's a lot of differences in culture too, not just language. You mentioned one thing about the cans this morning.
Yeah.
And remember the little guy, and he has a great big belt with a couple of feet extra on it. Not about to cut it off, man. All kinds of differences in culture. You couldn't communicate with them. They didn't know a damn thing about the mortar or anything about being in the military. So they really were a drag on us, not a help.
They knew nothing about field sanitation.
Oh.
And more than one commo man would be running a wire, to find the break in it. He'd put his hand around the wire and he'd run, letting the wire slip through his hand until he came to the break. Well, there'd be almost anything on that wire.
A lot of hand infections.
Yeah.
Well, when you're down to half strength, what kind of decisions do you have to make in reallocating work to get the job done when you don't have but half the people that you're supposed to have to do the work.
Guys doing 2 or 3 things up there. You got supposed to have 8 men in the squad, and you only got 4. Well, they just work harder.
That's right. Some of those men in the squad would be ammunition handlers. Well, the gunner and the squad leader would become ammunition handlers as well. You see, when I had a platoon in C Company, I had 15 men in my platoon, and I had 4 guns to serve. Now, 2 of those men were myself and my instrument corporal, so that means 13 men served 4 guns. So that's 4 and per gun.
How far did the ammunition typically have to be carried from the last point that a truck or Jeep could get to?
Well, we can Jeep right up next to the guns.
Right next to the guns.
And, you know, you had two Jeeps, each with a trailer in each squad. One carried the motor, the other carried ammunition. The Harley Versal goddamn Jeep would go right up next to the gun.
That was probably how you could survive, because if you'd had to be pulling on those carts.
And then we'd bring ammo from the rear, 2.5 tons usually, to replenish us.
One impression I got from the records is that the number of rounds fired in that first few months was really not very high. A lot of the command reports will say, it's 500 or 600 rounds in a month. And considering what the intensity of the action was, I would have guessed you were firing thousands. So what kind of action was going on? What kind of firing was being called for? How frequently were missions coming in?
I think we fired on specific targets, specific observed targets, whereas later in the war, they just threw out explosives to barrage an area.
Yeah, we didn't do that.
We did not do that.
And I would guess, and I don't know, not being in battalion headquarters, I would guess that was in a way dictated by the fact that we didn't have all the ammunition in
That's
the world.
right. That's right.
Short on ammo, short on spare parts.
Although I never remember being in a company where we were out of ammunition. Did that happen along the way?
Well, there were some times when they put the limits on us, don't fire more on this, just to conserve it a little bit.
Yeah.
Biggest problem was breakage, they get, in the winter, get that hard frozen ground, put a motor on it, breaking elevating screws all over the place, person-wise.
In firing point targets, were you going through the FDC all the time?
Always went to FTC, if all possible, sure.
Okay, so
FO to FTC, FTC to the platoons.
okay, so by the time y'all went into action, the early method of having the FO call the instructions directly to the guns, that was history.
I don't think that was ever done, was it?
It's an amazing thing to think about, but I've heard a lot of guys talk about it from the early days of World War II. The FO called in the azimuth, the elevation, and the power raise.
Well, I never heard of that.
Well,
I don't know how the hell he can.
His azimuth.
His azimuth compared to the gun azimuth is obviously different, very different.
Yeah.
How the hell could he do that? Unless he has a plotting board and
You had to
knows
know where the guns
exactly.
were.
Right.
Jesus, you have to have good jokers in a reasonably in a proper position in FDC when they set up a table in their instruments and make the calculation. They got the map. That bastard, that joker up there in FO, he's got his glasses and maybe in one of those wonderful SCR 300s that you talk about. They're so wonderful, and he's trying to get targets and stay alive. But they use it. They spit out a map on a hard surface and use the instruments.
What happened in November? There were several instances of the Chinese coming in, overrunning multiple positions.
He told me a story this morning. He knows more about it than I do, sir.
Well, let me tell you sort of what I recall from B Company's perspective, and we were supporting the 1st Rock Division. I think we were assigned to them even when we fired our first
That's
mission.
correct.
And the first rock, I don't know what kind of organic transportation they had, but we had a lot of vehicles, and one thing I remember very vividly was our rolling into a little town that became kind of well known as a site of one of the bigger battles in the Korean War called Pusan. And we rolled into that town with the first rock infantry on our vehicles, and that was sort of their entry into town along with us. And there were some tank units, I want to say the 72nd Tank Battalion, I may have that wrong, Carl, you may know who it was, but we had an American tank unit with us, and we came into Pusan the latter part of October, and as we entered the town, and we hadn't gotten very far, and I say the town, we kind of went over the crest of the hill. I don't remember much of a town. There may have been a little village there. Here came a mortar crashing in, I think at 120, and this was, I'm sure, a Chinese fired round, and subsequently it became apparent that the Chinese were in fact in the hills there big time, and that was the first Chinese prisoner was captured there. So
With MacArthur saying, no, they weren't Chinese.
right. But that B Company's role in that was to support the 15th Regiment of the 1st Rock Division. The other companies, I think, were supporting other regiments.
The 11th and 12th. The 11th, 12th, and 15th made up the first rock.
Yeah. And for several days there, as I recall, we were, and winter was beginning to set in then. It was getting pretty cold, especially at night. But what we were doing was supporting this rock division as they were trying to continue the advance to the Yalu. We were about 40 miles south of the Yalu at that point, and that was sort of the prelude to what became a disaster.
For about 4 days while we were in Pusan, we were in effect surrounded. About the 29th or 30th of October, elements of the 1st Cav came in, and we knew that, well, they had broken in through this great perimeter we had, and we were very pleased to see them because now we would have some American riflemen. And it was the 8th Cav with their 99th Field Artillery. And that night, the 99th did not lay their guns, as I understand it, and so the 1st Cav's artillery were not much help to us. Also, while those 4 days, there was a parachute drop, supply drop to us, both ammunition and gasoline. And another reason we were glad to see the Cav come, because that meant that we were not alone, not only personnel-wise, but there'd be supplies available.
Yeah, there was a salient, really. The 1st Rock had gotten ahead of much of the rest of the Army. I think the 6th Rock had gone even farther. They actually got to the Yalu. The 1st Cav came in on our left flank, and I think their stated mission was to relieve the rocks.
Yeah.
However, the 15th Rock, I know the 11th had probably been, 11th and 12th may have been routed by then. I don't know. The 15th Rock was still in position even after the Cav came in, because we were supporting them at that time.
Were there any circumstances in which missions were called in by other units rather than Cycle Chemicals observers?
I mean, contacting our FTC?
Yeah.
I don't know of any.
I wouldn't expect so. I wouldn't expect them to have the communications to do it.
Yeah.
They would contact RFO or some other official and say, how about doing that?
Okay. So it would come from the FO to the FTC.
Yeah. What I've seen on a number of occasions is on the OP, which was very often with an infantry company commander, you might have the artillery observer, the mortar observer, and with some American units, we would even have an observer, very often an enlisted man from the Regimental Heavy Mortar Company, and the company commander would say, hey, I'd like to have fire out there, and we'd sort of decide who could deliver it or who would, and have at it.
There were times when there was a period there when a lot of time we were supporting the Australians, and I would go with the B Company was in support of the Australians, of the British Commonwealth Brigade, and I would go with the battalion commander, a young, healthy guy, and all I could do to keep up with him going up a goddamn hill. And I'd stay with him, and he wanted fire there or there. I'd just contact the FO. The FO I knew could handle it and tell him to do it. I wouldn't do it. And the FOs are out there for that purpose of calling in the mission, giving necessary information, and adjusting the fire and reporting on its effect.
Speaking of FOs, and this was beyond what the scope of what he should have been doing was, but Wilhelm, Lieutenant then Captain Wilhelm, loved to observe fire. So we get into Unsan, and here is Wilhelm as our forward observer. He goes up and observes fire with the rocks, and of course he had no business doing that, but that's what he loved to call fire.
It's pretty tough to run all of the affairs of the company while you're doing FO work or being a cook or a mechanic, for Christ's sake. That's a big mistake that some leaders make a lot of times. They love to get their hands on this or that, and so they do it like that.
I'm thinking how many times I've seen the same problem in an oil refinery. I remember telling a young supervisor, don't get caught with a valve wheel in your hand when it should be a telephone.
Yeah.
Now, bearing in mind that 90% of the people that watch this tape will not have a clue, let's start with, an FO sees a target. Give me an example. What does he actually call up and say to the FDC? What happens in the FDC? What words does the FDC call out to the gun positions, and then what information flows back? What I'd like to do is, for people who don't have a clue, give them a good mental picture of what actually happens from I see a target to Brown's own target.
Well, my memory may be.
I wasn't fast enough. I wish I could have caught.
my memory may be a little fuzzy now, but my recollection is you get on the hill if it's virgin territory, and let's say you've just gone up there with the infantry that is occupying that hill. You pick out a registration point. What's the term for it?
We call it register the guns.
Base point or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. And that becomes your the point on which you want to register the guns. And I believe, we're sitting there with maps. It is a no-no to give your position, because you sure as hell don't want that. The guns will know your position, or you will have given it to them with some kind of code. We used to use some complicated code like Henry Black, where every letter was a number. I mean, not too hard to break. But we would call a shot in on that first, what we hoped to be a round that would hit on that registration point, and it invariably wouldn't hit. And I guess you did that by giving map coordinates of what you looked out in front of you to see, and you said, okay, these are the coordinates, fire on that.
No, you register thing, you fire one out there, and then you tell them write so much, or?
Yeah,
Yeah, well-
but once you get that first one, I mean, to get the first one, you gotta give them a coordinate, right?
That's
Yes.
right. In fact,
Yeah, but then
You may have agreed on it before the FO went up.
yeah,
Yeah, FO, you go up there and register on that point.
yeah, or you know, very often I picked my point after I got up there, but
Oh.
but you then try to establish something that is on the observer target line, so that you're looking at that round, and you've adjusted it left to right, and then you establish a bracket, and it's a 400-yard bracket.
And reduce
used
it
to
by
be. You split the bracket to 200. You split it again by 100, and then you come in on the target.
But the Fire Direction Center has to know the location of the observer, and has to know the location of the intended target.
And the
Because-
location of the guns.
No, well, yes, but
Yeah, the guns they've got
Because-
plotted. Yeah.
because the Fire Direction Center can see nothing. All it's got is a radio or a telephone. The eyes are the forward observers, and his line of sight is from him to that intended target. The guns might be over here. So what is right or left to the man who's got the eyes is not necessarily right or left to the guns. It might be over and short,
Yep.
depending on the angle from which the observer is looking at it.
But the FTC adjusts.
The FDC has plotted this on its map. It measures how far that target is from the guns, and that distance is controlled by the number of powder charges on the projectile.
So the observer's job is to call it as he sees it.
As
over
he
or
sees
under.
it.
The FDC takes care of the fact that may be right or left to the gun.
That's
That's
correct.
right. The observer can be indifferent as to where the guns are.
Yep.
And they translate it into powder charges and right, left movement of the guns.
So the orders, what would be a typical firing order from the FTC to a gun position?
The first order is platoon adjust. That lets the platoon sergeant, I was a platoon sergeant in C Company, and we were so short of officers, I never had an officer with me. So my only link with anybody, any place, was my telephone to the FDC. I knew nothing else. And I would get these orders. The first order would be platoon adjust, and I would yell out, platoon adjust, so that everybody would hear it. All gunners would know, all squads would know that a fire mission was coming up. We would get the azimuth, which is so many mils. We would get shell HE. We had only two kinds of shells, HE, which is high explosive, WP, which is white phosphorus, which was a smoke shell. And the last of these four elements, the last would be the powder charge. So many rings. And
You might tell them that way back, maybe in World War II, a lot of people were changing the elevation. We didn't do that. We stuck with a constant elevation, 900 mils.
What were the advantages of that?
We didn't have to fart around with changing the elevation.
Yeah, simplicity.
Simplicity.
Fewer chances for mistake.
Yeah.
The place a gunner could make a mistake, and it was bad if it did, was in the number of powder rings, because that controlled the range.
Okay, so now the guns frequently were pretty spread out.
Well,
Enough
yes,
so that
it would be a waste of ammunition to have them so close together, because
or
the
conservation for the enemy's ammunition.
the explosive radius of the projectile was such that we ought not to have the shells hit out there too close together,
And
because the guns were fired in parallel.
In pairs, you mean? Or?
No, four guns all in parallel,
All in the same direction.
all exactly the same azimuth.
that was when a platoon was firing individually, which we did a lot of. Massing the company was, I think, much less common.
And we never massed a battalion, right?
Never to my knowledge.
I think they did later, though.
Really?
For 61st, I think.
Okay, now somehow the FO has to know when to expect the shell to hit. So how does he get that information?
Okay, the Fire Direction Center person who's in contact with that FO, as soon as the guns have fired, the platoon sergeant reports rounds away. Or if it's a series of rounds, it'll say rounds complete, and off we go. That'll be immediately translated out to the FO, saying rounds on the way, time of flight, so many seconds.
That's why you see a couple of histories on the website. That title is Rounds Away.
Yeah, yeah. 83rd and another one that you and I talked about, 85th, I think.
That's where they get the name.
I had a fleeting thought there, but it fleeted.
Well, one of the, I guess the ultimate command in this whole thing is the observer saying fire for effect, right?
Yes. Now, that command, if it is relayed to the gun position, really doesn't matter too much, because the guns are going to do whatever the fire direction says to do, which is, after that first round, the zeroing in rounds are completed. Then comes, well, let me back up a little bit. The fire direction officer or the gunnery officer has been told by the FO what kind of target is out there. Is it 500 men, or is it a tank, or what? And he will then decide. He knows what his inventory of shells are. He will decide how much he's going to throw out at that target. And if he's got a platoon of 4 guns here, and he's going to fire out 8 shells, well, that means 2 rounds apiece. So that the fire for effect means that we have hit the target with our zeroing in, or are close enough, because our explosive effect of a single round is pretty big. The guns will do whatever the FTC tells them in their series of commands.
You mentioned types of targets, tank, 500 men. Was there anything that was done differently when you had these so-called human waves attack, where there might be a couple of regiments coming up a hill?
Fire a hell of a lot more.
I think I'm the only person in the battalion who was never on FO, so I can't say.
Well, I was never on the OP where we had one of these mass, human wave, as you call it, attacks. I've been on the OP when we had attacks, but I think there were periods, and I want to say sometime in '51, with certain companies where they were literally firing into huge numbers of people who were attacking when the Chinese were involved, but I was never there.
Were the OPs particular targets themselves?
It could be. If the enemy knew what was there. Of course, OP is pretty obvious where you put an OP. It's going to be where you can see something. Well, they figure out where the hell OP likely is. Well, sure, they fired on OPs.
I don't remember having a feeling that they'd singled out the OP, because it was usually a whole bunch of infantrymen. If we were in a defensive position, well, I don't know that they could detect where the OP was. The time I recall on an offensive an attack where we literally started moving down the hill to go from hill range A to B with the infantry, and I can't remember who we were with. I'm inclined to think it was the Australians, but as we were moving along, and we had prearranged our fire so that it would keep advancing ahead of our own infantry, and we'd kind of call in whatever it was. We began to get mortar fire on us as we were advancing, and yet I don't think that was because I happened to be the observer. I think it was because we were with, they could look down. It was a broad daylight attack. They could look down, see the whole infantry unit moving toward them.
But you can imagine it's not hard to figure out the likely area for an OP, and you got to be pretty dumb if you don't know that you put the OP out of action, you put the guns out of action.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to hit the guns. All you got to do is kill a couple of guys, the observer and the radio man, for instance. That's it.
Were OPs often overrun?
I don't know of any specific instance to you.
Yeah, you know, Bruce, you may have a better recollection of this when we were supporting the Australians in April and they were under really heavy attack. I thought one of our OPs was literally calling fire in on his own position.
They
or
were
close to it.
Of course, the Australians were surrounded.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't know that they were overrun, but it was pretty close. Yeah.
Yes.
How were the British and Australians to work with?
Terrific. They were all volunteers. In my opinion, the Australians were terrific soldiers, terrific fighters, and terrific drinkers.
If we had either the English or the Australians or the Scots riflemen in front of us, we felt pretty safe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because if they weren't going to hold, they'd let us know so that we could get out. Because as a platoon sergeant, I felt responsible for the men I had and for the guns I had, because I'm worthless without my guns. And so if you make me run away and leave my guns, well then I'm worthless. I've got to have those guns. So give me a few minutes and I'll pack up my guns and I'll get out with you.
Had some nice side benefits with them. You know, the Army, our Army, supplied us with this wonderful stuff, approved by the WCTU, 3.2 baloney, you know. And we got the Australians, they had Japanese beer, Asahi, Japanese beer. I don't know what the hell it was, 5 or 6%. It was a lot better. And it wasn't, as I don't recall it ever being frozen. You get the American beer in the winter, the thing's frozen solid. You put it inside the shirt, thaw it out, see? And it's just like horse piss. You know?
Well, the Australians and I think the other Brits had a wonderful confidence builder, and that was called the rum ration. And when you were on the OP, they'd come around, you hold out your canteen cup, and they would slug you with some rum, and that was great.
I remember the first sergeant come along, everybody gets a shot.
You've already mentioned a couple of these occasions, and I know there were many where you were not particularly well protected by the rocks.
Oh, you weren't protected at all. They were a burden.
When you had ROK troops in front of you, and there was going to be one of these collapses, how did you perceive that? What were the omens that this was going to happen? What did you see first that started setting off alarm bells?
You see a stream of rocks coming down the road. They've already thrown away their weapons. They got no weapons. They're streaming down the goddamn road like at Kunu-ri, right?
Yeah, and the first instant of that, we were talking about Pusan, when the big attack occurred, which was November 1. The rocks were, I happened to have a gun position next to the road that ran north out of Pusan, and the rocks were streaming down that road, and my platoon sergeant said, hey, you know, we need to get out of here. I called the company commander and said, hey, the infantry is running by our position, we need to get out of here. And he said, just hold tight. And my platoon sergeant, who was certainly smarter than I was, came back about 10 minutes later and said, you got to get us out of here. And the rocks were still running through our position. So they did pull us back a couple of miles. But yeah, unfortunately, the communication was not good with the Rock Division. So when they retreated, that was the way you got the message.
Most of the, I guess the December, January, on into the spring of '51, the whole 8th Army was falling back down below the 38th parallel. What sorts of actions took place when you were basically fighting, as I understand it, a rear guard action?
Just driving down the road. I can't place any particular thing that we did at that time. Mainly, you just went down the road.
Yeah, the first step of the retreat happened at Unsan, and the first of our companies that really suffered some casualties, lost some people, had some MIAs, had some prisoners, was A Company. And I think that would have happened on, early morning, November 1st. Maybe it was about a day before the B Company incident. I don't know if I got that date wrong.
The big attack was the night of November 1, so it was November 1 to 2.
But didn't A Company, weren't they overrun about a day before B Company, or was that the same night?
I think it was the same night.
Yeah.
Yes.
But they had some substantial losses and had people wounded and at least a few captured. B Company was more to the third platoon rather, and I think you counted up a number of people we lost. I'd never looked at that number, 24, something like that. And this platoon was totally overrun, lost communications with the company, and as I indicated this morning when we were talking about it, the company commander, in kind of a desperation move, went charging up the road in the late hours of the night to get them out, and we lost him.
They weren't all killed, taken prisoner. I identified one guy who somehow snuck out, Garcia.
Yeah, I heard there were, and I've forgotten really, that there were a couple of them that came out of there.
I know Garcia, and there probably were a couple more.
Yeah.
Well, as I understand it, Garcia and this other man were not with the guns. They were on the machine gun.
Oh, on an outpost.
And so, because the reason I learned this is because we wanted to know about Yell, who was in one of the squads.
Right.
And we asked Garcia about it. He says, well, I know nothing about the guns because I was separate from the platoon
He was on an outpost.
with the machine gun.
Yeah, okay.
But that whole period, beginning with Unsan, and this marked the Chinese intervention, on back to probably the next really difficult stand the Army tried to make was at Kunu-ri, and we were by then with the 2nd Infantry Division. The 2nd Infantry had huge losses. They lost something, I was just looking at one of the reports, something over 7,000 killed during the Korean War, but they probably lost half that number at Kunu-ri, and they took the brunt of the Chinese attack, and they were in fact the rear guard to enable the rest of the Army to escape. And we supported them during that period. Fortunately, we went out by a lateral route and didn't go down what became known as the Gauntlet. Then just a series of retreats, as I remember. We wound up going then to the Australians. We retreated through Pyongyang. We retreated through Seoul. Left Seoul on this January the 4th of 1951. But it was just a long retreat with stops along the way, some enemy contact, sometimes out of contact with the enemy.
Yeah, one of the reasons I think that our battalion was designated to be some of the rear guard was because we could get into a position rather rapidly, and we could get out of a position rather rapidly, much more so than an artillery battalion.
Yeah.
And so, having the second mortars there, as I recall, we would set up our guns and not even fire. You see, we'd be ready to do so, and as the whole baggage train went by, then we'd pick up and we'd back up and set up again, so that in our defensive position, we didn't do much in the way of firing to affect that.
But you were there to cover.
That's
if
right.
needed.
That's right.
Yeah, I remember at Kunu-ri particularly, we fired some missions. In fact, I was on the OP, and I remember the company commander said, it was dark, and I'd like to have some light out there. He said, could you, and there was one of these thatched roof houses out on the field, and he said, could you burn that? So I fired WP, and the house blazed, and we could see what was going on around there. But the second infantry there was a period, and this is referred to in one of the accounts of the war that Colonel Bell had written about, where we took the remnants of a battalion of the 9th Regiment of the 2nd Infantry out of, this was north of Kunu-ri before the ultimate line was drawn there. We took them out on our vehicles, and I remember doing that in the wee hours of the morning, and they'd just been shot all to hell.
C Company at that time had been assigned to the 9th Regiment. That's where we lost Whitaker.
C Company, I think they wound up really being trapped up there and surrounded.
The place was called Kujang-dong. If you look on the map, you see Kunu-ri, and the Chongchong River flows from northeast to southwest. And if you go along the southern bank of the Chongchong from Kunu-ri, you'll get to Kujang-dong, and that's where C Company was surrounded for a while, and that's where C Company lost a number of people.
I think it was in May of '51 that reversed, and the Allies began moving north again. And you went up through the Chipari Valley, and I'm not sure if y'all may have left about that time. I'm not sure on
I
the
left in
exact
July.
time.
I left in June.
Yeah, I was still there in that period, and it's kind of vague in my mind. My recollection is that
We'll just put that down to faulty recollection.
right, after the Chinese launched, what was that called, the Spring Offensive or something?
April 22nd,
Yeah.
Chinese Spring Offensive.
The 8th Army really contained that, although there was certainly some mishaps and some units overrun. But I think from that point forward, the 8th Army took the initiative, and of course Ridgway was in by way before then. He came in in January or December? Maybe. Well, Walker was killed in December. I think Ridgway came in right after that. There were some of our companies that fired just tremendous numbers of rounds back during that period and on into the next month or so. And the truce started when? The truce talks.
They signed 27 July, and they went on for months before that.
But the truce talks
started sometime during that summer.
Had to be June, because they had started when I left in first part of July.
Oh, had they? Yeah.
I thought they had started
Yeah.
before that, a long time.
Yeah.
Well,
And I'm not going to be very useful to you from this point on, because about the last 3 months, I was sent back to headquarters company, so that was like going on R&R. So I never heard a shot fired in anger after that.
I know it was a long time before you got replacements. When you did start to get replacements, were they trained in what you needed them to be trained in, or were they raw material?
well, I was a platoon sergeant. My first replacements came in January of '51, and they were all privates. And it didn't matter to me what their training had been, because as it turned out, they had practically no training other than basic. And so they became ammunition handlers within the squads, because we had our squad leaders and gunners, and we just got some more bodies in.
Reasonably intelligent guy, you can teach him how to be an ammo handler pretty quickly. But I talked to one guy this morning, interesting, there's guys like him. He was drafted and sent to cook school in Japan, and apparently he led his class and did terrific, and he loved it. And then they sent him to 2nd Mortar Battalion and made a truck driver out of him. And then a gunner. That was a good for
Hey,
him.
give me 10 minutes.
They used to bring the replacements up at the night chow, and in January it's kind of dark by the time it's supper time, and so these guys would be brought up onto the line in the dark, and I'd be told that I had these guys, I couldn't even see their faces, and I would say, find a comfortable place in the snow to lie down and don't move around tonight, and I'll take care of you in the morning. I'll get you to a squad and whatever. And I thought to myself, here are these guys, maybe a week ago they were on board ship or something, you know, and they're brought up here, it's dark, there's snow on the ground, it's very cold, and I tell them to sleep in the snow. My sympathies went out to them, but
Welcome to Second Killing.
there was no other alternative.
That reminds me of some of the effects of the bitter cold. We already mentioned the frozen beer, and Tommy mentioned the frozen rations, and Carl just mentioned putting your sleeping bag down, if you can get in one at all. It's going to be on ice or snow. But one of the problems we didn't anticipate and caused serious difficulties for a while until we get with it was keeping the vehicles able to run. You know, you think a vehicle is sat there all night long and that cold, you can't start it next day. You've had it. So we had what was the initial policy? Start them every couple hours or something. We found out that wasn't enough to do it every hour, and in a lot of cases run them constantly or they ain't gonna start.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we would have startup detail.
You'd have a detail going on, starting every vehicle going.
You know, artillery units have meteorological sections along with them. And so my instrument corporal happened to be just chewing the fat with somebody in an artillery outfit behind us, and it had been terribly cold last night. And he found out from the artilleryman that it had been 47 degrees below zero.
Ooh.
And we were sleeping in the snow.
Pretty
Yeah,
cold.
yeah. The cold, and in fact, it just dominated everybody's thinking.
That's
I
right.
mean, I don't think people were nearly as concerned about sort of the usual concerns that a soldier in combat would have as they were just trying to find a way to stay warm, or you never were warm. It was just intense.
One thing about staying warm was after you have a couple of weeks or a couple of months without taking your clothes off, you got a nice coating of stuff all over your skin. You know, the grease is built up. And if you're lucky enough, as we were once or twice, to get near a shower unit, to get to this division as a shower unit, and you go through that, get all this grease off yourself, and you're now nice and clean, you freeze to death for the next week, where you get the good grease back.
Yeah. I had 2 showers in Korea, and I swam in a river once. So I had myself cleaned 3 times in the year I was there.
But you were refrigerated.
Well, gentlemen, we're out of tape.
Okay.
and out of battery, and Peggy's calling me.
Okay, well, that's good.
At some point,
That's
the
a good
message
stopping
has become
point.
overwhelming. Listen, y'all just participated in producing a historic document. I will guarantee you there is no document anywhere that deals with that part of the history of the battalion of the Chemical Warfare Service.
I don't know what document we're talking about. What are you gonna do, put this on TV or something?
It's going to be edited to remove the erms and a few other things. But then I'm going to use pieces of this in my documentary. And yeah, actually, I have 2 different outlets that I'm hoping to wind up eventually with something that's like PBS, History Channel, that kind of thing.
You gonna have our words and our faces on there and all that?
Well, technically, I got to make you sign a model release to give me permission to do that, but I'm assuming we can get around to that later on. At the very least, it'll be sold at the gift shop up there.
Yeah, good. We get a royalty out of it?
No,
Probably about as much as I do. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Hey. I can't hear you.